Welcome, guys, back to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I'm thankful to have Craig Mullaney with me today. Craig is a partner at the Brunswick Group, an advisory firm specializing in business critical issues. He is also the best-selling author of The Unforgiving Minute, A Soldier's Education, an Army Airborne Ranger, an Afghanistan combat veteran, and a Rhodes Scholar. Craig, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Of course, thankful to have you on, and thank you for your service. um for those of us that don't know you as well, can you get kind of take us back to the beginning, where you grew up, your family situation, what type of kid you were, things like that.
Yeah, I grew up in a pretty normal blue collar household in Warwick, Rhode Island. Moved to Wickford, Rhode Island when I was 5. Public school kid until high school. I was the oldest of 4 kids, Irish Catholic family. So yeah, I guess I was a pretty independent child. I spent a lot of time with friends, roaming the woods behind our house. I wasn't a particularly, gifted athlete. I was really into wrestling. Wrestling was really my passion in high school, and continued a bit through West Point. Yeah, there's kind of pretty interested student in a variety of subjects, voracious reader. But I didn't have any idea growing up of what sort of career path I would take, and pretty minimal exposure to kind of the professional class, if you will.
Yeah. You talked about, your academic motivation. I saw that you were a valedictorian. Where did that motivation come from?
Pretty intrinsic, I suppose. It was an external pressure. I really enjoyed my classes across a range of subjects, and I suppose I was probably competing against myself more than anyone else. And I wanted to go to a top university, and I knew I would have to really excel inside and outside the classroom to have a chance at the kind of the best schools.
Yeah. You talked about it a little bit, but you ended up going to West Point. Uh, at a young age, what was the process of deciding, you wanted to be a part of the military?
Um, it was a little bit more serendipitous than planned. One of my high school buddies was an Army brat, and his dad and grandfather were West Point graduates. And the summer before our senior year of high school, I went on a road trip with him, and we happened to stop at West Point because he had family friends there and we could stay for free. So we had, I don't know, I can't remember if it was a night or 2 nights, but it was my first introduction to any of the service academies. And the place and the people I met really left an impression on me, and I explored the opportunity very quickly because most kids who are thinking about a service academy are starting in middle school or pretty early on in high school, and like all the deadlines were sort of end of summer, so I had to very quickly turn around applications. And so it's a bit of a concurrent process. Like I wasn't sure that was the path for me, but I got an application in and I started learning more, and I did you can kind of go and stay with a cadet for a day or two. And so I did that immersion, and that was really the clincher for me. I spent this day with a cadet who was on the wrestling team, and I was like, this is the place where I will thrive, where I will be challenged. Of all of the institutions I visited, it was the one that the premise of West Point is not what it will do for you. It's a challenge of whether you have what it takes to be a part of the institution, and whether you can contribute to something bigger than yourself. And that aligned, well with my own values and I guess the way I was raised in my family. I didn't know much about the military specifically. The idea of early in my career being put in leadership roles was compelling. I had some inkling of my interest in leadership from being, a team captain and student government and things like that in high school. Neither of my parents served in the military. Like many people in my generation, my grandfather had served in World War II, but he passed away when I was pretty young. So it was pretty distant influence. And it ended up being a phenomenal experience.
Yeah. I'm curious, obviously there's, anybody that makes a commitment, to any branch of the military, subconsciously knows that they're willing to give up their life for their country. I'm curious, did you have that perspective, at 18 committing to West Point? Like, how did your parents or siblings think about that? How did you think about that?
I mean, kind of being a parent now, I'm sure it made my parents somewhat nervous, but they didn't betray that to me. And, I think I was a pretty typical 17-year-old who felt themselves invincible. It's also it was a different time period. This was 1995, post Cold War, period of real American strategic dominance globally. There was a widely held view that technology was sort of obviating the need for, what we think of as sort of hand-to-hand combat, and that you could fight and win largely bloodless wars. And that was really the kind of the prevailing view, even through my time at West Point. And that, I think, mentality did not shift until the global war on terror in 2001.
Yeah. Yep. As you get to West Point and as you reflect on your time there, who should want to go there? What kind of makeup or, what should their mental attitude be for wanting 4 years at West Point?
I don't know if you're familiar with the book Grit and the research of Angela Duckworth, but really the basis of her research was studying West Point new cadets and which ones were more or less likely to complete their first summer and then ultimately graduate, and discovered that this notion of grit and resilience was one of the strongest predictors of success at the academy, and that grit is a combination of both sort of passion and interest and sort of commitment and determination. And so I think that is a bit of a key for students who are thinking about a career in the military and are pursuing the service academies specifically, is there has to be some kernel of interest and passion. In my case, I was largely ignorant of what life as a second lieutenant would be. But I would encourage anyone considering a service academy to, do as much research as possible to get a sense of what life as a junior officer will be in whichever service they're pursuing, and to get try to come to as much of a determination of whether that's a potential future that you could be excited about, because that's the North Star that's going to keep you going and when things seem tedious or difficult, or you stumble. And then that other factor of sort of determination, that can evidence itself in many ways for a high school student. You will see at the service academies a lot of kids who are, either multi-sport athletes or very strong athletes in high school. It's a combat leadership is a physical sport. The kind of demonstrating an interest for and enjoying various leadership challenges. That doesn't just mean being a captain of a team sport or a student government leader. It can take a variety of forms: scouts, religious services, etc. And then I think for the service cabs in particular, you need to have a very strong academic foundation, and particularly a strong foundation in math and science. All of the service academies have bachelor of science degrees. You can major in the humanities, and you can major in the humanities, but your foundation is going to require real strength in calculus and physics and chemistry and the rest.
Yeah. As you look back, is there a story or something that stands out from your 4 years there?
There's so many. It's it's an entertaining. Well, looking back, it's all probably much more entertaining than it was at the time.
Or is there like any current, is there any advice you would give to a current student? Like just,
a current student at the academy?
Yeah. To take advantage of a society, or take, I don't,
find as many informal and formal opportunities to practice leadership. Whether that's being, taking a team lead on a project for a class, or finding an extracurricular activity that it's going to challenge you as a leader. It's a 4-year leadership laboratory, and the more repetitions you get, and the greatest variety of contexts, the better positioned you'll be when you ultimately get to lead a platoon, somewhere between 6 months and 12 months after you graduate.
Yeah. After that, you went to Ranger School. I know you did Airborne School and the Air Force Academy. Anything stand out with those experiences?
If Ranger School is like a PhD in endurance. It really pushed me to the breaking point. For listeners who aren't familiar, Ranger School is a voluntary school that typically it's officers and enlisted non-commissioned officers from combat arms branches in the Army, infantry, artillery, etc., who volunteer for this program that's meant to build small unit leadership skills. And it's done over the course of a 3-phase program in the sort of woodlands, mountains, and swamps of Georgia and the Florida Panhandle. And as a way to simulate the stress of a real combat environment, Ranger students are significantly deprived of both calories and sleep over an extended period of time. So you take a training regime which is rigorous and intense to begin with, including everything from airborne jumps, long marches under heavy weights, raids and ambushes in the middle of the night on mountain slopes. And you add on to that maybe a 500,000 calorie deficit a day and 3 hours of sleep a night for close to 3 months, and everyone's going to find their breaking point. And you discover a lot in the course of a school like that. I think one thing you discover is that you can do much more than you think. But even supermen and superwomen have limits. And that's critical self-awareness and group awareness to have for when you're actually in a combat leadership or a real world instance, to be able to know when the people you're leading or surrounded by, your peers or yourself as a leader, are no longer capable of making the best decisions. And Ranger School taught me a variety of, patterns to observe, tactics to use to keep myself and keep others motivated and moving, even when they're exhausted or, at the sort of the bottom of their motivational curve. It's 100% the best training I could have possibly had for what I would ultimately end up doing in the Army.
Interesting. After that, you went to the University of Oxford for 2 years as a Rhodes Scholar. As you look back, I guess with respect to your military career, do you feel like that time period helped you?
It did, not in so many direct ways. I wasn't studying military tactics at Oxford, but it taught me a very different perspective of discipline. I think what I learned at West Point was, I interpreted it as discipline, but it was really extreme time management. If given a list of 100 impossible tasks to achieve in a week, how do you structure your time and stay on task to complete all that work at a high standard? Oxford taught me what I think is probably a much more realistic definition of discipline, which is the ability to stay to a goal, construct your determine the operational steps to achieve that goal, and to be able to pursue that objective in the absence of any external structure provided. So really, you arrive at Oxford, you're given a library card and told you've got to hand in a paper or take a series of tests 12 to 24 months later that determine the entirety of your grade.
Yeah.
Go figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think that that was probably more realistic preparation for life. And, really what you end up doing as a lieutenant or junior officer in the Army, you don't always have such clear orders, or if you have a clear objective, you need to figure out how to get from A to Z. And it's often not the most linear path. I think the other thing I learned from Oxford, particularly the kind of program of travel I had while I was there, was being much more comfortable in ambiguity and in unfamiliar cultures and circumstances. I later, when I landed in Afghanistan and was familiarizing myself with our area we patrolled in southeastern Afghanistan, having little inkling of the language or culture, or really any of the quote unquote human terrain, I was so grateful for having had repeated experiences in Eastern Africa and South Asia and South America, where either alone or with a handful of friends was navigating a culture that was, equally unfamiliar. And that gave me, I think, a confidence to do so in the future, and maybe even kind of a mental rubric for how to situate oneself in those circumstances.
Yeah. After Oxford, obviously, I guess during Oxford, 9/11 happens, and then after in 2002, you start your journey with the US Army. Um, you know, uh, again, obviously there's a lot that goes on in between 2002 to 2005, but as you look back on that period of time in your life, I think it was the 10th Mountain Division. um you were training a 40-man infantry rifle platoon. um it's a loaded question, but what stands out for you during that time period?
Yeah, I'm most proud of preparing my platoon at Fort Drum, New York, and leading that platoon through the first 3 or 4 months of our deployment in Afghanistan. Um, and not just the work of completing our day-to-day mission, but building a resilient team that could bounce back repeatedly in the face of monumental challenges and fight harder and stay stronger and closer. And that those bonds have persisted almost 20 years later. I count myself as very fortunate to have had that opportunity to serve my country in an hour of peril, and to do so with some skill and honor alongside an amazing group of, in our case, all young men.
A lot happened with Afghanistan in 2021. um you know Biden withdrew the forces there. As a veteran, that was out there risking your life. Obviously, thankfully, you never lost it there, but you could have, right? How have you reflected on, I guess, a lot of historians are calling it the end of the US involvement there in terms of a combat mission. you know a lot of people have been angry at the way it ended. There's a lot of different factors, humanitarian factors for the people in Afghanistan, the US soldiers, their lives as well. How do you have you been able to wrap your head on how you reflect on all that's gone on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex question. Yeah, I think to some degree, we will need the perspective of time to evaluate, the strategic cost benefit outcomes of policy decision. The operational execution of the withdrawal, I think with some justification, upset a great number of veterans, not just military veterans, but I'd include in that, aid workers and diplomats. Again, not just from the US, but from a variety of countries. In particular, the sort of agony of not knowing whether the many Afghans who put their lives at significant risk for us as interpreters and contractors and soldiers serving alongside us on missions, that the the visa process and the evacuation process meant so many of those individuals were, left behind and would likely not fare well under Taliban rule. And that's a sort of a deep moral injury, in a culture, like the US military that really believes in leaving no one behind. And that is not in any way to besmirch the really Herculean efforts in the waning days of the occupation to evacuate as many people as possible. But I think there's hindsight is 2020, but I think that is a lasting scar for so many of us. I have no idea whether the interpreters I worked with in Afghanistan are alive, dead, in Afghanistan, are refugees, are in the US. I don't know. And that's something that haunts.
Yeah, 100%. During this time period, you talk in your book about losing Private Evan O'Neill. Can you, I guess, talk about, that experience, and, if you have any advice to, military leaders today on handling, grief, but simultaneously, the next day you're back in, Gardez, so it's almost like you had to compartmentalize and,
Yes, I mean, we one of the kind of major engagements we had in September of 2003, Private O'Neill, who was in my platoon, was killed. It really kind of shook the whole platoon, and certainly me as the platoon leader. What I think is relevant for other leaders who may find themselves in maybe not that a precise circumstance, but something similar, and it could happen at outside of a military context, is, I think, first a correction in mindset going in. All right, so I think I shared a mindset which was fairly prevalent during this period in American military culture, that the definition of success was, sort of zero casualties, right? And that is an unrealistic expectation, and that's a particularly arrogant perspective to have. It assumes that you control all the variables in a complex real world situation. And, there's kind of saying in the Army, the enemy has a vote. And, on that day, in those particular circumstances, Evan's number came up. That I spent years replaying every moment of that operation to pinpoint, the thing that I had done wrong to lead to that sequence of events. And, I never found that thing. I never found that. And sometimes you can do everything right, and some people will get wounded or killed. So I think, I would hope future lieutenants are giving, have more realistic expectations of that happening in their own experience. And I think giving some thought in advance to, how do you process grief most effectively so that you can continue to lead effectively? And how can you, as a leader, support your platoon, your unit, who will all be grieving individually and collectively? Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. So after that, 2005 to 2008, you come back and you're a history instructor at the U.S. Naval Academy. I'm curious, transitioning back from, 200 plus combat missions in Afghanistan to normal U.S. society. As you look at yourself in '05, do you feel like, obviously mental health is talked about a lot more today, but do you think you dealt with PTSD or, things like that? And
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think anyone who has experienced trauma is going to experience post-traumatic stress, whether that amounts to a disorder that prevents ongoing sort of normal functioning in society is a different question. So I think the trauma certainly certainly changed me. It left a mark. I don't think it was, in my case, debilitating in any way. And I'm, perversely grateful for that experience because it has shaped me in so many ways. But it's absolutely a challenge coming, one day you're in Afghanistan and, 48 hours later, you are back in normal society. Within the space of a week, you've gone from driving a combat patrol to looking at a grocery store aisle with 15 varieties of paper towels and trying to make a decision. And
yeah,
you go from being in close quarters with your platoon, and to the degree I'm closer to many of those than my own siblings, those guys, and then you're alone. As an officer, I went back to an apartment, like a lonely apartment. That's an enormous shift to make. I'm grateful that I had, loving family and friends, and that I think I was conscious of the risks and, invested a lot of time writing and processing the experience. That's not easy for everyone. A lot of guys in my platoon came back to very difficult family situations and insecure finances and a harder time processing what, for a lot of the frontline guys was, even more intense, more quantity, traumatic experiences. So I think that's, this has been the case for combatants since time immemorial. And, soldiers have found kind of means of processing grief. The ancient Greeks and Romans did so by literally acting out drama on stage in front of their, fellow veterans. I think we're trying to figure out what that looks like in the 21st century.
Yeah. Yep. Uh, so then 2008 to 2010, you are working for the Obama administration in the Department of Defense. You eventually rise to the principal director for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia policy at the Pentagon. I guess, um, we spoke about Afghanistan from the soldier's perspective. Um, as someone that was contributing to the U.S. strategy, um, is there something obviously as civilians, no matter what, we're going to criticize, right? So is there something you would say to us about, the complexity of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and how we should be evaluating, the job that the Bush administration did, the Obama administration did, Trump, Biden, like how we should be
Hmm.
evaluating.
Yeah, I mean, it's over a 20-year span. Four presidencies have, each wrestled with um, very difficult policy challenges. Um, sometimes those are simplified to the, number of troops that are deployed, the speed of withdrawal. Um, I- it's there are complexities within complexities within complexities, in a very dangerous part of the world that is unfamiliar to most Americans, and we're apart from a few high points of interest in 2001 and 2009 during the debate over the surge in Afghanistan, in this summer. For the most part, Americans and their elected leaders have tuned out of Afghanistan entirely. Um, I I think there are implications there for America's ability to execute long-term strategic operations in another country. Um, you need all elements of society to be engaged in order to be successful. And I think one of the issues in Afghanistan was you had not just the U.S. military, but that was the bulk of the sort of the manpower in country. Many, everyone back again and again and again, who represented a small sliver of American society, whose elected officials had tuned out. And that needs to be better connected for us to be successful in the future.
Yeah. Working for President Obama, um, can you talk about what that experience was like? Obviously, as civilians, we read, but you worked under him. Um,
Yeah.
do you have any good stories or anything that comes to mind when you think about your time working with him?
Yeah. I mean, I had very limited interaction with President Obama during the administration. I worked more closely with him and the senior team during the campaign in 2008. He struck me as incredibly well prepared, studious, curious, and eager to hear all views in a room, and to sort of pull out of people in particular, sort of kind of dissenting opinions. I think it was a real strength as a leader. I mean, I will cherish the time I spent at the Pentagon. Every one of the visits that I had to the Situation Room for there's all sorts of acronym meetings that one goes to there as you're kind of in the decision-making process. But every time I went to the White House, I got a sort of a jolt of electricity through me. It was always a thrill. And that feeling of being at the center of history making and knowing the sort of the weight of responsibility that is on your shoulders to give the best counsel with limited information under with limited time, that I think that sticks with you. I think another element of anyone who's kind of served in a national security role and then is outside government is, if you're a curious person, intelligence briefings are fascinating. And I think you know so much more about any given situation from the intelligence you receive than anyone on the outside does. And so now on the outside looking in, I always have some reservation before making any critique of policy, because I know that the people who are sort of inside the room have different and often better information than I do.
Yep.
I'm always looking at the incomplete picture. So I think having some degree of humility as sort of voters and outsiders, and respect for those who are in the system, who are working incredibly long hours, are doing so for, much lower pay than they would get in the outside world. It's just a useful perspective to have.
Yeah. During this time, you come out with the book, The Unforgiving Minute. I'm curious. You see, you already had a lot on your plate. Working, for the government. What was the incentive to write this book? And, were you kind of surprised that it became a New York Times bestseller, or how was that book writing process?
Yeah. So in fairness, I wrote the book before I was in government.
Okay.
And it began as a way of processing and distilling the experience I had had, kind of forming my own narrative and being able to share that with the friends and family who matter the most to me. You can only get the question so many times, what was it like? Or, how did Afghanistan change you? When you realize like that's not a 1 paragraph, 5-minute conversation. I mean, there's so much to unpack. And I've always been someone who loves writing and kept like copious journals through my whole life. And so I started by just putting it on paper. I had no expectation that the book would have wide resonance. I totally misread the audience that would buy the book. I really thought it would mostly be purchased by fellow, veterans, people in the military, people interested in the military. Not really the case at all. The primary readership has been, generically people interested in leadership, young adults who are kind of forming their ideas of the world and who they want to be in it. And I think that sort of the degree to which my story as a coming of age story resonates with them. And then within the military and community, it's really military family members. So I hear a lot from spouses and kids who say, this has helped me connect with my spouse who is a veteran or who's on active duty. It's given a kind of a point of departure for a conversation. And the long-term value, which you'll know from having a podcast, writing a book, is it's a platform for you to speak in other venues and, to be sought for opinion on, events. And so I'm really grateful that I kind of made the investment in writing a book because of the way it's allowed me to connect with so many people afterward.
I'm curious, in the book, you detail a lot of personal details, about your family situation and things that happen there. How was that process? Obviously it helped in the sense of readers appreciated the humanization of who you were and talking about, the development of the person. And life doesn't just like end while you're in combat. Things happen. um as you look back on that, were you okay with that decision?
Yeah, I mean, it was really sort of guidance from my editor who said, there's a lot more, if this is the education of a soldier, if this is the formation of you as a man, how can you leave out a discussion of your parents? How can you leave out a discussion of your romantic partner? And that will ultimately be a kind of an on-ramp for a much broader audience who might otherwise, not feel a strong connection with you as the protagonist. So I definitely think it added sort of dimensionality and depth to the book. And I'm not, I sort of no regrets about how I wrote it. I mean, the one frustration with writing, a literary memoir or literary nonfiction is you can't include all the people who matter to you. And who made you who you are, because you'll just confuse the reader. Like, there's only so much capacity for you to, track various figures. And so, there's a lot of people I couldn't ultimately include in the book because there weren't enough ways for me to tie a through line, in various sections. So that's why it's a memoir and not like a autobiography or it's not a history book.
Yeah. So after that, you transition to the USAID. Is there anything about that experience that you would like to speak on?
The rationale for me was that I'd learned a lot about the use of military force in the sort of national security process and as an instrument of national power. And I wanted to learn more about the role of, non-kinetic, developmental assistance and the role that plays in, not just breaking things, but building them back. And, in Afghanistan, that became obvious, I think, to most folks, was that you need a Herculean effort was needed to build institutions and revive the economy. And USAID was a place where I could, kind of both learn that and, kind of bring to bear my experience and relationships across the White House and Pentagon for the benefit of USAID. So that was a phenomenal experience.
Yeah. Then you transition to business, working for Ustream as the senior VP of content, operations, and strategy. Is there anything that you would like to speak about that time and just transitioning from government to business?
Yeah, I mean, really the stretch of my career in technology, following government was, you know, there's a few levers of impact that you can have in the world. Um, yeah, I think government and policy is one of the biggest levers that you can pull to change the world. Another one is technology. And I, at both Ustream and later at Facebook, the opportunity to kind of learn more about technology as a lever for impact was was appealing to me. It also really fundamentally challenged me, and kind of learning leadership in a completely different context. I mean, an entrepreneurial, a startup environment, or a sort of a high growth tech company environment requires different strengths as a leader. And I'm, you know, I looking back, I'm very grateful that I've had these sort of distinct leadership laboratories in uniform, in politics and policy, and in, you know, in a technology business that, you know, position me now as a consultant to help a really broad range of senior leaders in business.
Yeah. And then 2013 to 2018, as you mentioned, you were at Facebook with strategic partner development. Um, you were working with CEOs and entrepreneurs to develop their public presence on Facebook and Instagram and other places. Um, is there something that you would recommend to current CEOs or leaders listening to this on their relationship with social media?
Yeah, I mean, well, whether it's social media or sort of an internal social media at your company, um, the sort of the technology of influence has changed, and the ability to have a dialogue at scale with your stakeholders, whether they're investors, employees, customers of the communities in which you operate, through social media and digital media, is such an incredible opportunity for you to have, you know, more influence and to better guide your company and have the impact you want to have in the world. And sort of leaving that on the table seeds the ground to your competition.
Yeah, cool. And then, yeah, 2018, your partner since then at Brunswick Group. Is there something you would like to speak on that? Again, you're advising a lot of CEOs and leaders on the intersection of leadership and digital.
Yeah, it's Brunswick Group is a phenomenal organization. It's really a firm like no other in the world that can sit alongside leaders of the most influential companies at their greatest hour of need, whether that's a transformation in their business, a crisis, or a financial transaction. And what I enjoy doing is bringing that full suite of digital strategies to bear to address those issues with all of the stakeholders of a company.
Yeah. Um, we mostly focused on your professional life. Is there, anything from your personal life that you'd like to, give advice on, whether marriage, fatherhood, um, you know, things of that nature?
Yeah, all the things that don't fit on the resume but really matter in the end. Um, I'm, you know, I'm a father of 4 kids. They give me the greatest joy, satisfaction, and challenge. Um, I think it's far harder being a dad than it is being a platoon leader or a consultant or a government advisor. Certainly children are far more fickle and unpredictable than any client.
Yeah.
And I think they keep you young at heart. I don't know. I think the last almost 2 years of the pandemic have reinforced for me that the measure of success in life is the quality of one's relationships, and those are the ones that are going to be with you when the jobs fade, and it's been an object lesson in balance and perspective.
Yeah. As you look back on, whether it's West Point, the Army, government, is there anything that you would change, in terms of how things are done?
I don't think I would change anything about my own, my own trajectory. Every quote unquote failure has opened some other opportunity. And everyone has taught me something, even the relationships that have not worked out. I guess I don't, nothing to add.
Sure. No worries. And then just, most of my listeners are in the 25 to 34-year-old range. Is there any piece of it, life advice or anything else that's on your mind, that you'd like to, just share, that you've learned from your time?
Maximize your 401k. Try to think about where you travel in the context of where you might not be able to travel easily with kids later on. So do that backpacking trip through South Asia before you have kids. I'll leave those 2 pointers.
Yeah. Craig, if there's anybody out there that would like to support you, is there a way they can readily do that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't need much support, but I love for people to be a part of my community. I spend most of my time sort of engaging on ideas via LinkedIn, and to a lesser extent on Twitter. I'm always grateful for anyone who reads my book, but more importantly, enjoys it enough to share it with a student, a friend, a son or a daughter. And if you're looking for charities to support that I think mean a lot to veterans, I support Disabled American Veterans, DAV. I'm also a big fan of Team RWB and Team Rubicon. But really any of the top veteran charities on Charity Navigator, that's the best way to pay it forward. That great gratitude that so many express for service members and veterans.
Yeah. Well, Craig, I just want to thank you for, coming on and sharing your story. For me, I was introduced to your book in 2009, and it changed my life. So I thank you for that. You know, I think also just your time, in the U.S. Army. All of us appreciate that. And there's just so much to, obviously we can't cover everything, but the book just teaches you so much context about, Afghanistan, and, just learning the stories of like the kids being taught certain things, that might, view the US soldiers as enemies or things like that, where, you wouldn't necessarily learn that as a civilian. And thank you for your time as a government official. Craig is a Brown Star medalist. So we really appreciate it, and yeah, thank you again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Arnav.
Appreciate it.